This method of gathering fabric is best used when you're working with a very long piece of fabric. So this is cooking twine or butcher's twine. You can find it in the kitchen section of your Walmart, Target, anywhere that sells cooking tools. And I have a long piece of fabric here. What you're going to do is cut off a long piece of this cooking twine. Just make sure that it's longer than the piece of fabric that you need to cut. So now that I've got my cooking twine cut out, let's move on to the sewing machine and get started with this very easy method of gathering long pieces of fabric. The first step when using this method is to change your sewing machine to your zigzag stitch, which for me is stitch number 4. And then I'm going to change the width of my stitch to as wide as it can go, and the length of my stitch to as long as it can go. So assuming we are operating with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, as most commercial patterns require, we are going to sew our zigzag stitch within our seam allowance. So we are going to place our fabric at the 1/2 inch mark on our sewing machine, and we're going to lay our kitchen twine over our fabric and leave yourself a good several inches of space at the end of that tail. So I've got the edge of my fabric lined up at the 1/2 inch mark, and I've placed my cooking twine in the middle. So remember, we've set our zigzag stitch to the widest width, so our zigzag is going to be going pretty wide, and we want to make sure that that zigzag is within our seam allowance, because we do not want to see that stitching on the outside of our fabric, because we're not going to remove that stitching. So I'm going to use my hand wheel on the side of my machine, and I'm going to sink my needle into my fabric. And then I'm watching my needle to make sure that it clears the other side of my kitchen twine. So what you're looking at is making sure that your needle placement is clearing each side of the cooking twine as it moves down the fabric. Once you're satisfied with your positioning, then go ahead and sew. Sew slowly. Take your time. The most important thing you want to focus on is making sure that you keep your seam allowance less than the real seam allowance that you're going to be sewing with. As you're sewing, if you see that you catch your needle into your cooking twine, then stop, use your seam ripper, and pick that stitch out. Don't keep going. I'm using my index finger to just keep my cooking twine in place to make sure that it doesn't start rolling out too far. So I'm just kind of using it here as a guide. I'm not really pushing my twine over, but I'm just using it here to make sure that it doesn't go any further than I want it to go. When you get to the end of your fabric, lift your needle and pull out your garment, leaving several inches of thread as a tail. So now you've got your kitchen twine all sewn in with your wide zigzag stitch all along the length of the fabric at the edge that you need to gather. So you've got this long tail of kitchen twine. Feel free to cut off some of that excess. Don't cut off all of it. Leave yourself several inches. So the most frustrating part about gathering long widths of fabric when you're using only thread is that sometimes this thread is a little too delicate and it can break, messing up your entire gather, and you would have to go all the way back and sew it back in. But with this strong kitchen twine, we are going to simply take hold of your tail here, keeping your thread tails out of the way, and you are just going to pull. Yes, see See how easy? It's pulling, and you can be as rough with it as you want. It's not going anywhere. And you can also use the tail on the other end to gather from that side. I love this method, especially when gathering skirts, maxi skirts, or just anything that's longer than several inches. Then I will go to this method because it's so easy. And then at this point, you would simply distribute the gathers to make sure that they are even. To whatever length that you were supposed to do so. So now that my gathers are in place, my knots are tied at the end, and everything is distributed how I want it, I'm going to just sew a regular stitch across the top of my gathers, but I'm not going to sew on top of my kitchen twine because remember, I still need to pull this out. So going back to my regular straight stitch at the default length and width within my seam allowance. So just next to my kitchen twine, I'm going to sew a straight stitch to secure my gathers in place. At this point, you need to be sure that you have your gathers distributed evenly and your fabric is the proper length. So I'm going to back stitch and sew a straight stitch. Remember to not catch your kitchen twine. You don't want to sew on that, but sew right next to it. Okay, now you've got everything stitched down and secured and gathered and distributed just the way that you like. So it's time to just pull out that kitchen twine. So I like to cut off one end pretty short and leave the other end long. Just helps for just kind of pulling it out. And I just kind of grab it. And when you're pulling the kitchen twine out, it may bunch up on you. Just loosen up the gathers. Because remember, the width of that fabric isn't going anywhere because you just secured it with the stitch. Pull out your kitchen twine. And you are left with your gathered fabric. And that's it for this method.